I'm going to introduce Andre. This is Andre Cohen. He asked me to introduce him as trainer, consultant, teacher, ally, coach, and not a villain. There's an important distinction he wanted me to make. I'm not exactly sure what context you can take that in. I've got all kinds of ideas, but I'm going to let Andre kick it off. Thanks, Andre.
Thank you. I just want to say my name is Andre Cohen, and I have had a number of roles and hats in my life. So started out my career as a residential treatment specialist and working in a psychiatric home for youth. And when they put young people as young as 6 and 7 in a residential treatment center, there are some huge hurdles in that young person's life. And I've been a high school teacher. I've been a college professor. I currently teach at Bethel University. And I want you to know that I am going to ask more of you probably than you're going to ask of me. In terms of what you know about intersectionality, about cultural competence, I would suggest that you probably know as much as I do, if not more than what I do. And so I'm going to draw on what you already know about this particular topic as we explore it together. I happen to be the person in front of the room who is the facilitator of this dialogue. Does not mean I have all the answers or know everything. And so I'll be drawing on what you know. I also recognize, and I hope that you recognize this as well, that we walk into rooms with privilege. So I walk into this room with privilege. I'm a cisgendered male. I'm a husband and I'm a father. I don't know if I'm upper, lower class or lower middle class, but I'm somewhere in between there. I have initials behind my last name that I've earned through the matriculation through higher education. I'm a Christian, so that gives me some advantages and days off when we celebrate. I'm also I'm 6'2", which offers some advantages. I'm also mildly attractive and extremely humble. Right? And so that combination provides for me opportunities, some of which I have not earned, but if I'm not mindful of them, they can become weapons, particularly to people who don't have or can't operate, or the world doesn't see them as valuable as they see the things that they've granted me. And so I want us to be mindful of that. I want us to be thoughtful of that. Before we begin, though, I do have a pre-test that I want to give you. Again, it's just a pre-test. So to get you thinking about some of the concepts that we'll talk about in the session, the stakes are very low. These will not be reported to anybody unless you want them to be. All right. So, and we'll also follow up with a post-assessment. I think there are 19 questions here, most of which you probably are familiar with already. So start by passing some of those there. So if you can take a couple and pass them back. If you can grab your handout. Does everyone have a handout that looks like this? So the first thing I'd like for you to do is notice that there are 5 gray circles. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what I would like for you to do is to place one identifier in each of those circles. All right? You get to select how you identify yourself or how other people identify you. One in each of those circles. All right? It looks like most people have 4, if not all 5. So what I'd like for you to do first is, out of those 5 that you selected, I want you to choose one and tell me, what does that indicator or identifier mean? So as a black man, I didn't choose to be black. I was told I was black. So that was an identifier that was given to me. So write down your response to that. Is it something that you have identified has meaning, or you gave meaning to that, or did someone give you the meaning? So I want you to select a second one, a second identifier. You can use the same one if you like, but if there's another identifier that you've identified, I'd like for you to answer these questions associated to that identifier. So the circle is 100%, right? So a circle is 100%. So I want you to divide one of your identifiers by these three categories. So by percentage, if you will, right? So if it's half, I cut the circle in half, and that's 50%, right? Or 25%, so forth and so on. So what percentage of the identifier you just selected was given to you by your family? What percentage of that identifier was given to you by your family? What percentage was given by your culture? What percentage of that particular identifier was given to you by your culture? What percentage was given to you by society? So society at large. And then lastly, how much of that have you decided is your identity? So you get to define that. So 100% would be one of those. There are four of those, so you could have broken it into quarters in some kind of way. Yep, so it is your family, your culture, society, and how have you defined your value? What percentages? All right, and this will be the last one that we'll spend time kind of thinking about this particular diagram. We'll come back to it later, but this will be the last thing that I'll have you do, is pick another, or it could be the same, identifier. And I want you to look at this question. Is this identifier important to you or important to other people? Important to you or important to other people? And actually, I missed the book. I have one more thing, just one. That's it, and then we're done with this part. Out of your identifiers, which of them give you privilege, and in what context? Which of those identifiers give you privilege, and in what context? Context being the setting, the environment. Are there contexts where your identifier can give you privilege? So at this time, we're going to ask Jim to kind of go around and take people's comments. And I want you to think about, as you were answering those questions about your identity, what came up for you as you were thinking about the percentages, thinking about what's important to other people, how you come to understand your identity or give meaning to that identity? What came up for folks as that process was going on? Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can just
Hold on.
I think for me, when you brought up, dividing a percentage of yourself, like my mind just kind of went, whoa. And I think 'cause to even frame it in that way, to see in terms of what aspects of my identity I identify with most or least, it just kind of like compartmentalizing that and kind of searching through that it's heavier than I think I anticipated. So it's just something to kind of chew through and process.
Yeah. I think Kelly.
Yeah, it was going to be on the same question.
Yes.
One of the identities, almost all of my identities were from others, what I think others perceive of me. And it was interesting that one of them, I think, it was hard to decide how much of a percentage that identity was important to me and how important it was in the society and culture. I first thought that it really wasn't that important to me because I don't really want that identity. And as I thought about it further, I thought, no, I kind of do like that identity. So I gave myself, I was 40, and then it broke down and all the others were family, culture, society, broke it down into smaller bits.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Other folks? Yes.
For me, the most like hardest thing was to think about like how other perceive you. Like I kind of not like try to do that because then it makes me, I don't know, just feel weird and like cautious. But I don't think I connect with any of them really. I just feel like I'm just DeMonte. That's how I am most of the time. But unfortunately, these things are assigned to me and I have like owned them, but I really don't think any of them really connect to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, DeMonte.
Right away when we were trying to, put different parts of our identity in these different little bubbles, that felt really weird to me because there's some parts of my identity that I can't separate like that. And I found myself like wanting to write in between the bubbles or something. And so like I found ways to work around it, but that was kind of challenging for me.
Yeah. 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 Our identities typically aren't, we're not compartmentalized, right? We're complex beings, and all of those things are in relation to each other, which is part of the point of this exercise, right? Yeah. Other thoughts before we move on? I want to say I appreciate your conversations, and I'll give you some time to talk with other folks about your identities and how you show up and the process that you went through in determining these things. So one of the things that I want us to really think about is this idea of intersectionality. And the thing I think is really interesting is that oftentimes we are encouraged to fit into molds that were not made for us, right? So as an example, and I give this story jokingly, but there's some truth to this, that I was not born black. I'm not suffering from a reverse Michael Jackson thing or anything like that. But the political construct that I was born into, the only category that was available at the time that they thought I fit in was this nature of this blackness, right? So in 1970, there were 3 options: black, white, and other. And so the nurse chose black because she thought that most fit me. But I'm much more complex than that, and I'm much more simple than that. So I'm black, but that is more and less of who I am, right? And so when we talk about this idea of intersectionality, we're really going to kind of delve into what are some of the society, social impacts of the recognition and the lack of recognition of our, of who we are as a total being. All right? So cool. So we'll come back to page 1 in just a bit. Let's go over to page 2. Just want to mention some things, some ideological concepts that I'm working off of, and want to make sure that's informed in everything that I do. And so I will say this, that there are some conversations that we'll have in our time together, a couple of clips that we'll watch that may in fact be triggers for folks. And I don't do these things for shock value or for sensationalism, but really to drive home a teaching point. That being said, if there are things that trigger folks or folks feel uncomfortable with the topic that we're kind of delving into, please take care of yourself first. You're no good to anyone if you don't take care of yourself. And so if that means you need to leave the room, I understand that. If you have to voice and say, you know what, Andre, if you could help us get to the point of that quicker, I'd appreciate that. I get that, all right? So I want to say that first and foremost. Secondly, what we also are trying to do in our presentation is be very much trauma-informed in all that we do. We understand that we all have had some form of trauma that has happened to us, and that we're sitting here because we are resilient. So we got past or got over or are working through those things. And so I want to capitalize on our resilience. And so when we're working with youth, there are a couple of principles that I just kind of want to read through so that we can understand that that's our guiding principles as we go through today. To read through this right on page 2, that we want to be very journey oriented when, particularly when we're working with youth, but that this workshop will be focused on our journey orientation. That we'll be trauma informed, that we won't be judgmental, so I don't have a particular way that I think you should respond or should not respond to things, but we'll talk about why we respond to things the way we do. This notion of harm reduction is embedded in our presentation today. Building trusting relationships. I will be honest and upfront with you with the expectation that you'll do the same with me and that we're authentic in that. Next is that we're really looking to be strength-based, so we want to build on on your knowledge and on your skills and on the way that you interact with the world that has brought you to this point. We also look at these ideas of positive youth development, that we're constantly building folks. And then lastly, holistic and collaboration, that we're going to build this training together, that this is something that we build together. I do want to talk a little bit about some truths about human beings. And so what actually motivates people to do things, to change, to move towards the directions of their goals. And the first is that human beings can learn, change, and grow. That's the first truth about human beings. They can learn, change, and grow, even when we don't see evidence of it. Right? Has anyone had a client or been a teenager and adults had an expectation, or you had an expectation that your client should have gotten something by a particular kind of time, or the adult said you should be at a certain place at a certain... Anybody have that in your own life? Yeah. Right. So one of the things that my parents hoped for me was that I would quit dragging my feet. So I don't know why I did it, but when I was a kid, I dragged my feet when I walked. And it's funny, when you buy your shoes and you buy your pants, you stop doing that kind of stuff, right? And so my parents had a hope that behavior would change, even though they weren't seeing evidence of it. Any gardeners? Anyone planted a garden, planted a seed, right? So once you put that seed in the ground, all things considered, you water it, you make sure it has ample sunlight. Do you check on it every 15 minutes? No. Why? Because it takes time, and you know that the process should work, right? And so when we talk about this trauma-informed responses, we know that these things should work even when we're not seeing evidence of it, right? And so if I have to see youth make changes, if I have to see it, if I have to be there, then actually that is not for the youth. That is for me, right? And so as a high school teacher, that was one of the things that I learned early on, that my students will mature when it's time for them to mature, right? They will flower when they flower. But if I have an expectation of when that should be or how that should be, I'll constantly be disappointed, right? So all human behaviors go, we also know that people do what they think works, even when what? Even when it doesn't work, right? So I love it when con men get caught. Love it. Why do I take joy in con men getting caught?
They're not able to con the next person.
They're not able to con the next person, which means they kept running their con until something changed, right? So something changed. And so the people do what they think works even when it doesn't work. But why do they do it? Why are people doing things that are ineffective and they keep doing them?
Because they don't know what other to do. Because they don't know what other to do.
Because they don't know what else to do. They don't know what other to do. What else?
Some people are set in their ways.
Some people are set in their ways. It's tradition. Faster results.
I said impulse.
Impulse. Mr. Adrian Peterson did not recognize this principle. He didn't understand this principle. Mr. Adrian Peterson, before, I think he's in the process of being traded, is that right? Or has been traded. But before that, he had to take a year off of his job. And why was he requested to take a year off of his job? Because he beat his child. I think the technical term is whooping. I'm not sure how you spell that, but to his defense, how did Mr. Adrian Peterson articulate the way he disciplined his child? What was his rationalization? That's how he was raised, right? What did Mr. Adrian Peterson fail to realize?
That wasn't necessarily the right way.
That wasn't necessarily the right way for this context, right? So why does the con man get caught? Because the context changes, but their con doesn't. But they do it because it worked at one time. And so one of the things we have to, particularly when we talk about this idea of harm reduction, we have to remind our clients, we have to remind youth that behavior may have worked, but they have to now look at a new or different kind of context to see if that behavior is still benefiting. All right? Lastly, all human behavior is goal-directed. I'll talk about those goals in just a second. Lastly, attitude is a reaction to goal. What is an attitude, or how do attitudes get described? As a bad attitude, as a positive attitude. Negative attitude, right? Anybody encountered someone with an attitude? Please raise your hand if you've encountered some. Okay, if you're that person with the attitude, raise your, no, just teasing. Just teasing, right? So, yes. Hold on just for a second. Let me get you the mic.
I had a youth in the streets of New York that I worked with whose nickname was Attitude.
Yeah, so that youth embodied attitude, right? So what is this attitude? Because I always got confused because my parents would say goofy stuff to me. Like they say, boy, fix your attitude. Or I don't like your face, fix your face. And so I would fix my face. And I'd get in trouble, right? But what we recognize is that attitude is not just about the emotional response, but it's what the emotional response is telling us. So think about being a teenager. You go to an adult and you say, adult, can I have, be, go? And they say no. What happens to that teen's attitude? It changes for typically the bad, the worst, right? But 5 minutes can pass and the adult says, you know what, they can do, be, or go. And they say, teen, you can do it. I'll drop you off and I'll pick you up, blah, blah, blah. What happens to the teen's attitude? It changes, it gets better. So what actually is an attitude? It is an indicator of goal accomplishments. So a bad attitude tells me that I'm working with someone who has not gotten something that they wanted or something that they needed. All right? So they didn't get what they wanted. A good attitude suggests that they're on the path to achieving their goals, even if I don't agree with their goals, but they're on the path of achieving their goals. So an attitude is about goal achievement, not just emotional response. And so lastly, what are the drivers for human motivation? What are the goals that people are going for? What is it that attitude is directed towards? It's directed towards three things. This idea of significance, belonging, and safety. Significance says that I'm a person with purpose and power, and I can do something. I was not an accident. I was born on purpose, and I can do something. Belonging says that I can be in relationships with people who understand my significance, who understand my purpose. Think about your friends. I would imagine that your friends understand your purpose and your power even when your family doesn't. Purpose, power. And then lastly, I'm physically, emotionally, spiritually safe to be in relationships with people who understand my significance. And so when we look at those three things and we look at attitude and we look at what we're trying to help our young people develop in terms of resilience, if I can get those three things or the combination of three things, I have a friend for life. I have not only given someone a fish, I've not only taught them how to fish, but I've also taught them how to purchase lakes and streams, right? So this idea of significance, belonging, and safety is crucial in looking at how do we help people develop. All right? So let's go to page 3. And has anyone read or heard of the allegory of the cave by Plato? All right? Great. So there are lots of movies that have been made based off of this allegory. And we won't go through the whole allegory for the sake of time, but there's some pieces that I think are important that we'll kind of tease out. The first of which is, well, let's just read the first paragraph. Imagine prisoners chained since childhood inside a cave. Not only are their limbs immobilized by the chains, their heads are as well, so that their eyes are fixed on a wall. Behind the prisoners is an enormous fire, and between the fire and the prisoners is a raised way, along which men carry shapes of plants, animals, and other things. The shapes cast shadows on the wall, which occupy the prisoners' attention. So first of all, these folks are prisoners. What should prisoners be thinking about? Escaping. But what are they fascinated with? The shadows. They're fascinated with the shadows. The shapes cast shadows on the wall, which occupy the prisoner's attention. Also, when one of the shape carriers speak, an echo against the wall causes the prisoners to believe that the words are coming from the shadows. The prisoners engage in what appears to be a game, naming the shapes as they come by. This, however, is the only reality they know, even though they're only seeing merely shadows of images. Is an echo the same as the original? No, it's distorted, right? Is the shadow the same as the original? No, oftentimes it's distorted as well. So suppose a prisoner is released and compelled to stand up and turn around. His eyes will be so blinded by the firelight that he'll not be able to see anything but the shadows. This will cause doubt and fear in him. Let's skip down to the last paragraph. What's thus enlightened, so to speak, the freed prisoner, so the prisoner is now outside of the cave, would no doubt want to free his fellow bondsmen. What would be the problem with a person who was in the cave, grew up, developed in the cave, is now released, is outside the cave, and then says, I want to go back and free people in the cave? What do you think might be some challenges for that person? What challenges might they face? Yes.
I want to equate this to a frontline program I saw last night, Andre, called The Last in Solitary. It was about prisoners, and it is exactly about the same thing. It was a brilliant, if you're interested in social justice and prison reform, and it was about how they went out in society. They just absolutely couldn't deal with it because they were used to living in a box. And so everything out there frightened them, and somebody walked behind them, and they saw shadows as well when they were out of the prison. They could not cope. And that's exactly what you've got here, I think. It's so similar.
Yep. Other folks, what might be challenges? Yes.
Well, once a prisoner is free, they have something that the others can't even comprehend, which is escape. Like they know things to exist that the others have no idea of, and that the others maybe can't even comprehend without being freed and turned around and taken out of the cave themselves.
Yeah. So even the concept of what it means to be free, if you want to take that mic to the back. Even the concept of what it means to be free could be a foreign concept, given that. Now, here's something I think is interesting, and I'll take that point in just a second. What I think is really interesting is that it doesn't say they were born in the cave. So how did they get in the cave in the first place? And what does it mean to be in the cave? Yes?
I would think it would elicit a response of resentment. Of who do you think you are? Who now you're going to come and tell us something?
Yeah. How do you think does this story, and we've just gone through a short synopsis of this story, how does this relate to your work as OWs, outreach workers? Yes.
I think a lot of our reality is shaped by our experience, and we have to remember that that experience defines us, but it won't define others.
So that our experiences may define us, but that doesn't mean it defines other people as well, right?
I just think it might be triggering. Like a lot of us OW workers, like we come from a numerous, array of different experiences, and if we're put into a specific situation, it could be very triggering. Again, with the prisoners going back, having those flashbacks of that space and that mental state that they were in while they were imprisoned, it just could be triggering, and I think we haven't touched on that point yet.
Yeah. I'll take your point, and then we'll talk about this idea of triggering, right?
I was just going to say, well, the idea of freedom, like one person's perspective versus another's of what is freedom.
So even the perspective of what is freedom, the movie Baywatch, and then to see women in hijabs, and they say one group is oppressed and the other one is free, and I wonder which one is which, right? So I wonder which one is which. So yeah, and this idea of triggering. So I think it's important that, particularly in those spaces, we have to be responsible for what we do with our triggers, right? So how we respond is extremely important. So this person wanted to go back and be helpful, but it may in fact be some triggers for them. And they have to figure out how they deal with those triggers, because those triggers will consistently happen for us, right? There have been a number of times when I've worked with young people at the high school, and I was like, that is me. But I had to also recognize that that's not me, right? So I can't lay all my stuff on that individual, and I had to really figure out what their family system was like. Who are they? How do I help them to achieve their goals, right? So cool. There's also exercise number 3 you can do at your own convenience about assessing my life experiences around this idea of being multicultural versus monocultural. And I'll leave that to you to do on your own. Gone through a lot of stuff. We're going to hit a couple of more kind of developmental concepts. Through our conversation. So on page 4, right? So first on page 1, we talk about our identities, right? And what I would suggest is that not recognizing other people's identities can be very harmful, not only to them, but to us as well, right? Can be very, very harmful. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea, and then we'll go to this, this video, this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so diversity is really about the law and the who. Like who's in the room, who's at the table, how do we look at that stuff? Equity is the intentions. So why do we have them at the table? Why do we want them? Why do we want to build these relationships? And then lastly is this idea of impact. And impact is what do we want to do now that we have them at the table, right? So why do we want them at the table, but now what do we want them to do? Or how do we want them to interact? The idea of equality versus equity, I'm sure we've seen this diagram and probably other examples as well. Ultimately, what we're looking for is an opportunity to include people, that we give them liberation. I like this particular diagram because it shows that somebody said, well, if you don't have a fence, you don't have boxes, people will just run on the field. It depends on what game we're playing. It depends on how people want to engage with that game, right? So there's that. And then there's also this idea of diversity. And when you look at those shapes, what do you notice about those shapes at the bottom of page 4? What do you notice about those shapes? Yes.
They're all the same shape, but they're all just a little different.
They're all the same shape, but they're all just a little different.
Multiple identities. Multiple identities. They can be hollow, and they can identify as being hollow, and they can identify as being circle.
All right. So they have multiple identities. A lot of times when I've participated in diversity trainings, they talk about either how much we are different or how similar we are. Very rarely do I hear both of those at the same time. So as different as we are that much more alike. And it's the nuances of those commonalities and those differences that make the difference in actually helping someone to be their best selves, right? So it's the commonalities and the differences, not either or, all right? And the price is pretty high, that when we're not able to see the other, we're actually able to hurt the other.
There are 9 subjects left. I can only use 4 for the heist. So a week after the seminar, I arranged to test the limits of their responsiveness to authority. So, a week ago, I arranged for them to take part in what they now think is a piece of unfilmed academic research at a university, and nothing to do with the show, supposedly looking into the effects of punishment on learning. And they believe now that this is part of their growth. In fact, it was a reenactment of a powerful experiment conducted by Stanley Milgram in 1963 to look at how normal people can commit atrocious acts simply because they're following orders. Milgram's parents were Jewish refugees in World War II, and his pioneering work speaks volumes about the nature of responsibility. It's being filmed with covert cameras.
Thank you.
They're introduced to an actor pretending to be another participant.
You didn't come from the same room?
No.
Yeah, you don't know each other. So.
No.
We don't actually know how punishment affects learning.
After a brief introduction, our subjects are tricked into thinking they've chosen their role as teachers in the experiment.
And if you could just tell me what your positions are?
Learner.
Learner and teacher.
Learner. Our subjects observe the learner being instructed by the scientist, who is just another actor.
This electrode is connected to a generator in a second room. Where we'll be going with the teacher.
Okay.
Just make sure that we have a good contact with the skin, and so it doesn't cause any blistering or burning. Is that comfortable?
That's okay, yeah.
Yeah, we just place these straps around your arms just to avoid any excess movement. Those aren't too tight.
No, that's okay.
No. The teacher will read out some word pairs to you. Blue girl.
The learner is told he's going to be asked a series of memory questions by the teacher. He will have to word pairs and then correctly remember them when offered multiple choices.
If the answer's incorrect, you will receive an electric shock.
The teacher is then taken next door and shown the generator, which ranges from 15 volts all the way up to a lethal 450 volts. The domestic electricity supply in the UK is, of course, 240 volts. Our teachers are given the list of questions and told to increase the voltage each time the learner gets a question wrong. They are then given an example of a low voltage shock.
And try and estimate in volts the amount of shock you feel you're getting.
Okay. Oh, shit.
Do you know how much that was?
Enough.
75.
It was actually 45.
Oh my god.
Teacher, begin.
Shoe horn.
Steam.
The point of this test is to see whether the teachers, our subjects, will call a stop to the experiment or continue to the point where they are administering seemingly lethal electric shocks to the victim simply because the scientist is telling them to.
That's correct. The next word is bicycle. The options tyre, race, helmet, shorts. That's incorrect, so there'll be 120 volts. I don't think I want to do this anymore.
If you could continue, please, teacher.
There is? No, I don't think I'm going to do anymore.
The experiment requires you to continue.
Yeah, even so, I don't think I'm going to do anymore.
Correct. According to plan, our accomplice provided many wrong answers. Each protest was coordinated to a particular shock voltage on the generator, and his responses were played via a CD.
That's wrong, 150 volts. The correct answer is Captain Shoe. Cup. That's wrong. 225 volts. He's in a lot of pain.
Continue, please.
But he's not comfortable.
We must continue to the end of the experiment. Whether the learner likes it or not, he has to go on until he's learnt the words correctly.
Okay. Forest. That's wrong, 240 volts. Are you sure this is not causing any lasting damage? He sounds like he's in a lot of pain.
Well, the shocks might be painful, they're not harmful.
What does that mean, though? They're not harmful. Sorry, I'm not getting you. When you say that they might be painful but not harmful,
They cause no long-term damage.
okay, so what does that mean? It doesn't leave any scars.
It causes no damage.
That seems very cold and calculated to me. This doesn't seem like a very. Anyway, golden. That's wrong, mate. 300 volts. Staple. The options are diet, jar, balcony, and bowl. I'm going to answer.
If the learner doesn't answer in a reasonable time, say 4 to 5 seconds, then you have to treat the answer as wrong and follow that procedure.
Did you hear that, learner? Just any response, mate. Come on. Wild guess.
Please continue.
345 volts, if you're still with me. I'm sorry. I can't do this, honestly. Can we stop this experiment? Because I can't do this.
If you don't continue, we'll have to discontinue the experiment.
Yeah, okay, fine. That's fine. I'm not going to do this.
Incorrect. 405 volts. Sorry, I don't know. Does someone want to check on him or something? It's just he's not making any noise now, and he was before. And well, I'm quite happy to go on, but I'm just a bit worried about.
If you would continue.
Yeah, I'm just a bit worried because he was. Like, he was like complaining before about the.
But no harm will come to him.
But he's not making any noise now.
It's essential that we continue with the experiment.
Balcony. Incorrect. 450 volts. You promise he's not. It won't.
Please continue with the procedure.
You said it hurts, but it's because it's like it says they're dangerous in a shot. It'll be all right. Yeah.
Please continue. Okay, I think we'll discontinue the experiment there.
All of the subjects were told the true nature of the experiment was to see how they would respond to authority, and that it would eventually form part of this show.
He is okay.
I can tell you, yeah, he's absolutely fine. You actually weren't administering electric shocks to him at all. He is.
In the original Milgram experiment, psychologists were asked to predict how many people would continue to the point that they were administering the highest shock on the board. Their prediction was 1/10%. They were wrong. The results of our experiment were almost identical to the original. Over 50% of participants continued up to 450 volts. The majority of people will administer lethal electric shocks just because a guy in a white coat is telling them to.
450 volts.
450 volts.
450 volts.
450.
So after the results of the Milgram experiment, I've now chosen my 4 subjects that will go forward for the heist. Phil was impressively resourceful when he was caught stealing sweets, and held in his anguish during the Milgram than defy the scientist. I did want to include a woman in the group. Jen was the only subject to take a long time to recover after the Milgram experiment, so I felt I shouldn't use her. Veronica didn't steal from the shop, so that left Vicky. Of all the subjects, she was the only one to have known the original Milgram experiment and call a halt to her involvement in it.
Can I just say, I can't do this because I've heard of this experiment before.
So I think she'll be quite interesting to use, although I don't know if she'll actually take the bait or not. Ali stole most from the shop, seems to be highly responsive, most outgoing, and seemed most happy to continue the experiment until he was stopped.
Well, shouldn't it have made more notches on the thing?
I'm sorry. Danny stopped the experiment, but in such an outspoken way that I suspected he would have real strength of character to bring out.
It's not even reacting anymore.
On your paper, if you can write down one thing you thought was interesting, one thing you learned, and one question that you have about this particular video piece. Any place. Any place. So one thing that you found interesting, one thing you learned, and one thing you have a question about, one question you have. All right, so what I'd like for you to do at your table, if you can get into triads or duos, and just talk about those 3 points. All right, so what did you find interesting? What did you learn? And what's one question that you had? I'll give about 3 minutes to do that, a minute apiece. All right? So I'm really curious as to what folks found interesting, questions that you might have about this video, or things that you may have learned. So, yes.
I just had a question about like the study in itself, like if the teachers were like getting paid or like a stipend or something, because I feel like that could have been a determining factor if they would have stopped earlier or if they would have finished the whole study, if they were getting basis of if they were getting paid or not.
Yeah, and the question was, were they getting paid to hit the buzzer or not? And I don't have an answer to that. That's a good
DeMonte,
question.
do you have a price tag on how much you would need to charge before you go to 450?
$3?
We discussed at our table the idea of just the anonymity of not being actually seeing the person that you're administering it to, but hearing it. And we kind of equated that to like the stuff that you can say on a message board or with a keyboard, but that you wouldn't say face to face, and how that kind of gives you that blind, like, I don't know, ability to think that you can do things that maybe you shouldn't be doing if you were actually face to face with an individual.
Yeah, yeah. that being face to face with someone, you may do something different than what you would if you actually had a relationship with them, or you could see them as a human being, right?
We thought it was kind of interesting that people would just follow orders by someone just because they had this perceived authority. And a question that I had about that was, would they still obey this person if they were not a man in a lab coat or a white man in a lab coat, but a woman in a lab coat or a person of color in the lab coat? Would they still have that perceived sense of authority as much as they did? And if that may have changed.
Yeah, would that have changed that? And interestingly enough, I don't know that those dimensions of this particular test have been explored, but that would be interesting to see how that would be. Yes.
I just thought it was interesting. I remember learning about the original study when I was in school, and at the time, like, people in the classroom, everybody was like aghast, like, oh my gosh, surprised that people could do that, yet when it's replicated, same percentage.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a hand right up here. Oh, yeah. Yes. Yes, my sister. Yes.
I thought it was really interesting. I mean, in my head the entire time, what I related it to was everyday microaggressions that happen when you're sitting in a group full of people and you like somebody says something like, oh, that's so gay, and nobody corrects that person. So it's like, because they're not on the other side of that microaggression, and they don't feel that pain, then they don't correct it. They don't stop doing it. They don't say stop doing that. Or, I mean, I think that's really what, and like just thinking about like the person that's, telling them that to do this is like, it's systematic oppression, like systematic racism, things of that sort. So like the bigger picture is way bigger than just like this dude pressing a button hurting somebody. Like, we hurt people every day and we don't even realize it.
Yeah, because we operate in a context, right? So this particular experiment was set up in a particular kind of context, and which it's an interesting question. And what was your Rosa? So Rosa posed, if the doctor were different, I might suggest that the context itself presented the challenge for the person to try to overcome, and it may not have mattered who the person was, but the context itself. Just like systemic oppression, it doesn't matter who the faces are of systemic oppression. I mean, we can look at law enforcement, we can look at court systems, that it doesn't matter what those faces look like, because the system is operating in such a way that folks don't get equal justice or access to goods, jobs, services, and money, right? Yes, sir.
My question is, why would you look at somebody, if you know you're causing harm to somebody, why would you look at somebody and ask if you can stop? Why, if you know you're causing harm to somebody, no matter if somebody tell you, why would you look at that person and ask them if you can stop causing harm to somebody?
Right. So Tony's question was, why would I go to somebody else if I know I'm doing wrong and doing harm to somebody? Why would I go to somebody else to ask them if I can stop doing harm to someone? Why?
They have power and authority.
Because they perceive that this other person has power and authority. What else?
They can blame that other person.
They can blame that other person for their stuff. So I didn't do this because I'm a horrible person. I was just following orders. This is just how we do things. I didn't do it. I just was, right? Yes, sir.
I think another thing to note is just what I would like to believe is that if the perceived person of power were to respond with hostility and say, no, you will continue, you will do this, that the people would then say, absolutely not, I'm not. But he was so measured and calm and said, please continue. Like, you will continue with the experiment. And they second-guessed themselves, and then they did it anyway.
Yeah. The key point, and I don't want to drag this out too long, but the key point is, when we don't see other people's humanity, that's when all of our personal privilege becomes that weapon, right? When we're not able to connect our story with other people's stories, that's when, and I got to tell you, it's a hard road to toe because we have a lot of things that are pushing us not to see each other as human beings, but to see each other as things. So if you go to page 5 on your handout, so I was the affirmative action officer for Anoka County, which meant that I was basically a bean counter. So I counted the number of people who applied for jobs. I looked at their racial background, their gender background, or their gender expression. We weren't taking, information on people's sexual orientation, but that certainly was in the back of other people's minds as we're trying to make these decisions about all this stuff, right? So collected all this data. And so part of that data came directly from the federal government. So the county's job was to report the stuff to the federal government. And this is how some of the ways that people were categorized, or people are categorized in the United States. And we call that categorization race or ethnicity. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between the two, but we use that. So this first is this idea of Hispanic or Latino, a person of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South or Central American, or other Spanish-speaking culture, regardless of race, right? Now, I want to let you know, are there any so-called Hispanic people here? Okay, cool. I have one hand. I will let you know that there are no Hispanics in Mexico. There are no Hispanics in Mexico. What do I mean by that? What are people from Mexico called when they're in Mexico? They're called Mexicans, right? And they're tribal. There's some tribal affiliations. There's some indigenous affiliations that people have and that kind of thing. But when they cross over into the United States, they become Hispanic. So this idea of American Indian or Alaskan Native, a person having origins in any of the original peoples of North and South America, including Central America, who have some qualifiers. There are some qualifiers here. Who maintain cultural identification through tribal affiliation or community attachment. So the qualifiers say if you don't do those things, then you're not American Indian or Alaskan Native or Native American or indigenous without these qualifiers. But what did the boarding schools, what were they designed to do? Create the lack of these qualifiers, right? Asian, a person have origins in any of the original peoples of the Far East, Southeast Asia, Indian subcontinent, including, for example, Cambodia, China, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Pakistan, Philippine Islands, Thailand, and Vietnam. Does anybody know people from any of those countries? Do they look anything alike? So why are they lumped into this particular thing? And I'll tell you why in just a second. Black or African American. Now, one of the things I was taught is that you don't use the word to define the word, right? You don't use the word to define the word, but here we go. Black or African American, a person having origins in any of the black racial groups of Africa. Interesting. Let's keep going. Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, person having origins in any of the original peoples of Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, or other Pacific Island. Lastly, this idea of white, a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. White. By the federal government standards, right? So this is what the federal government says is how we classify race or ethnicity. Now, the thing that's really strange about that is that Australia has a whole nother different kind of way of doing that. Race is a monarchy. Right? Sorry. So Australia does it differently.
What did I say?
Brazil does it differently. Canada does it differently. So what does this mean about this idea of this concept of race and racial identity?
It's political.
That it's political. Made up by who? Governments. So we are not a race of different individuals. We are one race of human beings. Now, I don't want to beat that drum too much because it sounds way too kumbaya, and I don't want to go there. But I do want you to recognize that the divisions that we have between each other is to turn us from human beings into things as our governments, our individual governments, choose to try to organize us. So what's at the root of that? What's at the root is this idea. So let's turn over to page 6. So on page 6 is the cycle of socialization. This is how I come to understand the world, right? So in my early years, I get missing history, biased history. I get the paradigms of those who raised me, be it my parents, my grandparents, caregivers, adoptive parents, whatever. They give me their paradigm, their way of seeing the world. And then I become socialized, or I learn how to act in that particular system and in that context. Then the cycle gets reinforced through government, education systems, the media, until I internalize it, until I embody all that external stuff they've been trying to teach me. And then I collude with it. I operate with it. I teach people what I've been taught. I hold people accountable to what I know to be true, right? Here's an example. When you color, what are you supposed to do when you're coloring in a coloring book? Stay in the lines. Who said? Right? What happens if you don't stay in the lines? Right? So that's one of those constructs of collusion. We teach, we monitor, and we advocate, and we continue that until it becomes institutional, right? So these institutions start to develop because we continue to be passive in that. But at some point, we have a choice to break out of that, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. So we recognize that we go through this community socialization process, and it keeps going. And this is where meaning is given to all of those identities that we have. This is the cycle that provides that meaning. And we give rewards to people who align closely to whatever the cycle is, and we punish those folks who are outside of what this cycle says is acceptable and good, right? So we have that. We also have this idea that, and so with that, along with that, is this idea that context is everything. Context is everything. When my grandmother passed, I finally understood my grandmother. I spent most of my life misunderstanding this woman because she would do strange things. Like she'd make us breakfast, and her breakfast for her was tea and toast, or tea and English muffins. And so she would take the jelly or the jam, and sometimes she'd open it up and there would be fuzz inside the jelly or the jam. My grandmother would scoop out the jelly, the fuzzy jelly, and then serve the rest of it. I thought that was creepy. I was like, that's nasty. Why didn't she just throw it out? But when she passed, I got her context. And what was my grandmother's context that I misunderstood for most of her life? Was the fact that she was raised during the Great Depression. And so her behaviors, so when we talk about this idea of cultural competence, a lot of times what gets missed is the context by which this culture was developed to have the behaviors that they have, right? So if we look down at the bottom of page 6, we see this carrot metaphor. Many of you have seen or used the iceberg theory of culture metaphor, and I found that had its limited lifespan. It's time to look at something a little more organic, right? So there's this idea of the carrot of culture. And above the ground are the things that you can see, or the artifacts of culture. So those are the things that you can see. But under the ground is what on the carrot? What do we call that part that's under the ground on the carrot? We call it the root, or the root, depending on where you come from, right? We call that the root. And the root is where all the energy and all the value is stored in that carrot. And so when we see an artifact, what is that a physical representation of? So I'm walking in my garden and I have rows of carrots and I see the tops of the carrots. What is my assumption when I see the top of that carrot? There's a root underneath it. So when we see artifacts, we must recognize that those artifacts are tied to values. Artifacts, values. So although wearing a hijab is a great fashion statement, it's much more than that, right? It's a statement of values. So what about sagging pants? Statement of values. So one of the things that frustrated me, so I came from St. Louis, and St. Louis is a really segregated city. Black people do their thing, white people do their thing. They know how to interact in common spaces, but the world is just different. So I'm teaching in St. Paul, and I got white kids from Frogtown who are sagging, and they got their hat cocked to the side. That was confusing to me. I didn't understand that. I was like, why are these white kids acting black? Until I realized that I had to ask myself, well, what is acting black? And then I also realized something else. Why were those kids sagging their pants, and why did they have their hat cocked to the side? Context. That's where they live. And so their values were to survive in the environment where they is, so they fit in just like everybody else, because everybody else was like that as well, in terms of their circles of influence, right? And so they valued that because that meant that they weren't going to get picked on, or that meant that they fit in, or they were able to get safety, significance, and belonging because they did those things, right? So we have to recognize that. Now, what happens when the top of the carrot gets cut off from the bottom of the carrot? What's the destiny of that carrot? Death. It's going to, at some point, going to die. Now, it may regenerate, and that's a whole nother workshop and a whole nother conversation. But it becomes difficult to find my carrot, and also the top becomes useless, right? It becomes useless. And when that happens, that X that's in that diagram on page 6, I call that X Ellis Island. I call that X being an immigrant, being a refugee. That X is being suffering from kind of this slave syndrome kinds of. So that X was designed to separate people, to create them so they could become things, right? So on page 7, I want you to look at this idea of cultural competence in a new and different way. That cultural competence is understanding the relationship between the context and the culture. Culture develops within a context. And what we know about context is that it's always changing, which means what about culture? It's changing as well, or it should be changing as well. People who can't change with the context or with the culture get left behind. They become dinosaurs. And we'll talk about them in just a second. So context is time, space, and geography. Culture is the adaptation to the culture. Culture is the culmination of artifacts and values, which is made up of thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and beliefs. We'll come back to those paradigms in just a second. So I want to go to page 8. So one of the things that we're talking about in terms of why does the U.S. and why does Canada and why does Australia, and I use mostly westernized countries because that was the easiest way to make those comparisons, but why do they do that? Because they are in search of power. They're in search of power. And one of the things that we know is that power is dynamic. And so in middle school, what did they teach you about power? What is power? How would you define power? Knowledge is power, is what they oftentimes say. What else is power?
Considered as being at the top of the food chain?
It's considered being at the top of the food chain or the top of the pyramid, right?
The strongest.
The strongest is power.
Popularity.
Popularity could be power. Money is power, as they say. Ultimately, what I'd like to offer you is that power is the ability to do two things. To get access to your significance, safety, and belonging, and to define your safety, significance, and belonging, right? So this power of definition is extremely important, particularly when we talk about this idea of intersectionality and this idea of cultural responsiveness. So if you look at page 8, there is a diagram there that talks about this idea of power of definition. And typically, the winner tells the story, or they shape the paradigm. They get to say what is right and what is good. And so the dominant culture defines itself in a particular kind of way, and any culture that is not a part of the dominant culture or close to the dominant culture gets described or thought about in a different kind of way. And so when we look at page 8, it's curious to me if the dominant group is male, and we look at those kinds of words, we can see different kinds of ways that plays out, right? If the dominant culture is heterosexual, we see how anything other than that starts to get defined, right? If we look at this as middle class values, as the dominant group, we start to see how other things get defined. So the power of definition is extremely important. And so for our clients, for our young people, for the folks that we work with, we have to help them to be able to define themselves because they've already been defined by the dominant culture. And so when I talk about this idea of dominant culture, what am I talking about? I'm talking about this idea of this white hegemony or hegemony. And a hegemony simply is a system designed and created by a group of people to benefit them. All right? So when we say the white hegemony, what we're talking about is a system that's been set up by white people to benefit white people, right? So that's important. This idea of the white man's burden comes out of this Rupert Kipling's poem that talks about how the white man needs to save everyone else on the planet, very much akin to the doctrine of discovery that was used to justify many of the genocide on indigenous people as people were expanding west. Then there's this idea of white privilege, and I don't believe in white privilege. And I'll tell you why I don't believe in white privilege. The way the narrative typically goes around white privilege is that the narrative that happens is that all white people are created equal. So they all have white privilege. And I don't believe that because I've listened and talked to white people. And white people tell me that white people aren't all created the same. What do white people call white people who don't raise to the level of class distinction and sophistication that most white people think they should? They call them white trash.
I mean, isn't that the whole point of intersectionality, is that you can hold white privilege without holding class privilege or gender privilege, and that doesn't mean that white privilege doesn't exist. It just means that you are under other forms of oppression that may feel they discount that privilege that you hold.
That is exactly right, and you've short-circuited where I was going. So very good for you, Kelly. Right? So what Kelly? Yeah, that's okay. But I'll just repeat what Kelly said. Kelly said, she asked the question, isn't that the point of intersectionality? That you can hold privilege in this area, but not in this area. And that is exactly right, right? So when I talk about this idea of white privilege, that's what I'm getting to. So because it was hard for me to tell my kids in Frogtown, my white kids in Frogtown, that you have privilege when they're getting they're feeling the same kind of hell that their other brothers and sisters are in my classroom, right? So trying to sell them on white privilege, that wasn't working. It was a waste of time, and it was a horrible thing to try to do, to educate somebody on a privilege they don't think they have. But one of the things I think is important to recognize is that even if you don't participate, there is a system of white supremacy that operates, right? So now here, this is going to be tough for some of us. But I don't have to be white to be a white supremacist. So when we talk about this idea of intersectionality, I can be an oppressor and not be part of the oppressor group. I can actually be in the oppressed group and be the oppressor simultaneously in terms of this idea of intersectionality. So what I mean by that, so let's turn to page 10 real quick. So most of the theories that I'm giving you, the things that we've been talking about, stem directly out of this idea of critical race theory, which is basically this idea that the law plus racial concepts plus social structures create the system that we're operating in. right? This oppressive system is a combination of laws, this idea of racializing people, and then the social structures that support those other two. It is this kind of oppressive system that we're in. So when we talk about this idea of white supremacy, it's important to realize that it is this idea that there is scarcity. So has anyone ever heard someone say, well, I got to get my piece of the pie? Or there's only so much pie to go around. Anybody ever heard somebody talk like that, right? Don't you know that life is not pie? So next time you hear them say that, say life is not pie. Because there's more than enough for everybody to get what they need, right? Because we don't all want the same things. So my wife was cooking and she said, Andre, go give me some buttermilk. I was like, I can't right now. I need to do something. She was like, well, we can't make this thing without buttermilk. And I said, well, I can't go right now. I got to finish this thing. And she said, okay, I got it. So she went to the refrigerator, and guess what she did? She got some milk, and she took the lemon juice. She blended the two together. Guess what she had? Buttermilk, right? I mean, it functioned very much the same as buttermilk, right? So when we talk about this idea of scarcity, we have to recognize that there's more than enough and that we all don't want the same things. So white supremacy operates off of these three pieces. One is scarcity. The second is the fear of scarcity. The fear that they're coming for my stuff, the fear that they're going to take my stuff, is the basis for white supremacy. And then lastly, that whiteness, the concept of whiteness, whether you're white or not, gives access to those other things or warrants access to those other things, right? So there are people all across the world who are trying to lighten their skin. Skin bleachers, skin creams, all sorts of stuff, not just in the United States, but worldwide. Why? Because they have fallen under this idea of white supremacy, that as white as you can get will automatically gain you access to goods, jobs, services, and money, to power, right? And so in intersectionality points out those points, that I don't have to be all across the top around the dominant group, but I can be in a number of different places and still enact harm or enact injustice given from what I am, from wherever I am. Part of that idea of intersectionality also talks about this idea of internalized oppression. We won't get into that today, but that is a part of it. One of the things that I think is also important to realize is that this idea of poverty, I don't like talking about poverty. And why do you think why might I not like talking about this idea of poverty? Because what? Because I experienced it? Yes, I did, Tony. Thank you very much for pointing me out, right? Right? Because it's a perspective. What else? It's a label. When we talk about poverty, who are we talking about? We're talking about people. People are not born poor. Systems make them poor. So we talk about the people, but we don't get a chance to talk about the systems that the people are adopting to, right? And so this idea of this white supremacy piece is that if we can keep talking about poor people, we don't have to talk about the system that they're responding to, right? So just on page 11. So ultimately what's at stake is the human soul. And what I would suggest is that people will do anything to get access to the human soul. And the funny thing about the human soul is that how many chromosomes are there in the human body? How many chromosomes? 37? I think it's 46. I think it's 23 and 23, is that right? 26? No. My point being, when someone calls you outside of your name, do your chromosomes decrease? No. When you don't get justice, do your chromosomes decrease? No. You were born human and you will always be human, as far as we understand how human beings can be human, right? Maybe some genes splicing in the future. You could be, part ram or deer or whatever. So one of the things that we recognize is there are some barriers to people recognizing their humanity. One are obstacle illusions. I can trick you out of your humanity using technology. And tricking you out of your humanity is treating you so unlike a human being that you start to act or think like you're not human, right? This idea that we dehumanize or we're participating in something that is dehumanizing, right? That's a trick because you can never be less than human. Race tries to make us less than human. Strict gender roles try to make us less than human. And poverty tries to make us less than human. And I can only not be human when I give up my humanity, right? So I can only give up my humanity. So when we go to page 11, we start asking some questions. So when we talk about this idea of intersectionality, and I would suggest to you that there's nothing wrong with people, that people are seeking significance, belonging, and safety. Why do kids join gangs? So part of it is fear, but the fear is because this is at stake. The significance, this belonging, and safety is at stake. We talked a little bit about this idea of oppression and dominance. Rules of power. Rules minus relationship equals rebellion. Rules plus relationship equals respect. And power is the ability to get things done. And when we work with our clients, when we work with our young people, we want to empower them. And that is ultimately giving them power, giving them access to get things done for themselves. I'm going to give you some homework. It's in your sheet. I want you to kind of fill this out on your own. I think that's page 9. Yep, page 9. You can fill that on your own. I think you'll come to some really good resolutions around that or some ways of thinking about that power dynamic. So on page 11, this idea of a steeplechase. Is there something wrong with minorities? Is there something wrong with our folks? And I would say, if you have an answer, that could be problematic. If you check yes, then we need to get a vaccine for them, right? We need to get some pills, find a cure for them. But if not, if there's nothing wrong with the choices that our young people are making, the folks that our clients are making, then what should we be looking at? If there's nothing wrong with them, where should our gaze then go? Context. To the context, right? What's the environment that they're in? And so many of us are familiar with this idea of ACEs, that there are a number of adverse childhood experiences that influence or change the way brains work, the way brains think. And some of those things are abuse, physical, emotional, or sexual, neglect, physical or emotional, or household dysfunction, mental illness, incarceration, partner violence, drugs, divorce. We all recognize that. But our job is to help empower our young people so that they can go to the next level. And so what is that next level? Let's go back to page 1. So just this last piece is that in that center circle, when you look at all of those 5 things, in that center circle is you. Ultimately, you have control of you. On the outside of that circle is all the things you don't have control over. And so when we think about this center circle, that is your locus of control. Everything outside of that, you don't have any influence over, but you do have influence over you. And that's what we want to empower our young people with, particularly when we talk about this idea of intersectionality. My name is Andre Cohen. Thank you so much for your time.